Howdy, welcome to Lecture 5 of Unit 8, our final lecture of World War II. And today we're going to finish up with the Pacific. Again, immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States faced some major challenges in fighting the Japanese. The Japanese had probably the strongest navy in the world, and they had not been defeated in hundreds of years, really. And so the United States, faced and lost some battles at Guam and the Philippines and so forth. But really the turning point came in 1942 at the Battle of the Midway. The United States had discovered through its code breakers that this attack was coming, and they weren't all that prepared for it. And so Jimmy Doolittle and some others went on a bombing raid of Tokyo to kind of distract the Japanese in order to buy some more time. And the United States was victorious at Midway, and this ended up to be the turning point of the war in the Pacific. Now, the type of fighting that took place in the Pacific was island hopping. It was mainly a naval and Air Force war with Marines being sent, and the U.S. method was going from every other island, really. Take one island, skip one. You needed to have, planes couldn't go all that far. The United States aircraft carriers had been damaged, and so they needed to have strategic islands in the Pacific to be able to launch more attacks and eventually get to Japan. The Japanese were an entirely different enemy that the United States had maybe ever faced before. The Japanese believed in what was called Jiokusai, and this was the belief that it was more honorable to die than to surrender, and they just simply would not surrender. In most cases, they would fight to their death. You had kamikazes, for example, which were Japanese suicide fighter pilots that would crash their airplanes into ships, aircraft carriers, so forth. And when you have an enemy like this, it's difficult to defeat. It's kind of like the enemy that the United States is kind of facing today, with roadside bombs, and even more worrisome and troublesome are the suicide bombers that will put explosives in their car and drive their car into their target, or strap explosives to themselves and walk into a place that is their target. Some examples of Jiokusai: at Iwo Jima, 21,000 Japanese fought and only 200 surrendered. At Okinawa, there were 50,000 American casualties. So this was some of the most brutal and fighting of the entire war was taking place in Japan, or against the Japanese, and this would be one of the major factors in the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Speaking of the atomic bomb, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, pleading with him to fund the project, to start the project. He was very concerned with Germany getting the capability of dropping a weapon of mass destruction before the United States had one. And so Robert Oppenheimer led this project. It was kept secret. FDR died, and Truman was finally made aware of the project. They tested it in New Mexico in July of 1945. By this time, Italy and Germany had already surrendered. Only the war in the Pacific was continuing. The three Allied leaders, which Churchill and Clemenceau, I believe, from France, and maybe even now Stalin wasn't invited to this. Anyway, they issued a warning to Japan stating that if Japan did not surrender, they would face complete and utter destruction. So shortly thereafter, the decision was made to drop the bomb. President Truman, who had not been in office long, was faced with this tough moral decision whether to drop the bomb. On one hand, he had to weigh the next step was invading Japan, and Americans had seen how brutal the fighting had been and how costly all the other battles had been, and the invasion of Japan would even be much more difficult and costly. But, you know, the negative aspect of this would be the killing of civilians. They didn't really know how powerful it would be. I mean, it had been tested, but it had never been tested anywhere near any human population. And so on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped the first bomb, and it did on Hiroshima, did massive damages. They waited a few days later. The second one was dropped on Nagasaki, and on August 14, 1945, Japan surrendered. It is still debated on whether the bomb or the bombs should have been dropped. There's no question that it saved countless American lives that would have been lost if, in fact, the United States would have invaded Japan. So the aftermath of the war, massive casualties. 30 million soldiers died, including 405,000 Americans, 25 million civilians, 35 million wounded, 3 million missing. So just unbelievable, staggering casualties. 30 million Europeans lost their homeland. There was massive destruction to the cities because of all the bombing that had taken place and the new methods of fighting. As a result of, after the war, the Soviet Union controlled most of Eastern Europe. Germany was divided. They could not come up with any sort of agreement. Germany was divided into East and West Germany, and really that was the beginnings of the Cold War, which we'll take a look at in our next unit.